I'm Elizabeth Archibald. I'm a historian of medieval Europe, and my research focuses on the history of education. I've been working on a project studying medieval school books from Europe around the 9th century. It's an interesting time from the perspective of education because around the year 800, there was a pretty dramatic increase in the number of books in circulation and lots of discussion of education on the part of people like Charlemagne. So I've been trying to figure out what education was actually like by looking at school books. Surprisingly, we have a large number of these books. This is before the printing press, so there's no such thing as a textbook that was published in any official sense, but we have hundreds of manuscripts apparently put together by teachers who just copied useful things they came across. Like this labyrinth and a bit of music copied into a book of instructional material by a 9th century intellectual. There's a lot of interesting material, but it's hard to work with. The books tend to be compilations of dozens of short texts and excerpts, and whatever someone found useful for teaching about Latin grammar, or the seasons, or proper spelling. They share a lot of material, but no two are alike. And with any given manuscript, we rarely know who made it or used it, or even where, since almost everything is in Latin, no matter where it's from in Europe. So the bottom line research problem is that we have a very rich body of material that we don't have the contextual scaffolding for being able to interpret well. So here's what I did. I took about 30 school books from around the year 800. Each one contains between 6 and 35 little texts on elementary topics. Here are 3 of them with some of the texts that they contain. And I contextualized each manuscript as a box of texts, where each text in the box is connected to each other text by virtue of being in the same box where someone thought they belonged together and lots of other people could encounter them together. And when you think about them in this way, in terms of connectedness, it opens the possibility of doing some network visualizations. Network analysis and visualization is more often applied to data sets like correspondence connected through their letter writing networks and that sort of thing. And there have been some efforts to look at the networks of early medieval intellectuals in this way. But anywhere you find connections between things, you can use this approach. So I put together some spreadsheets with the manuscripts and their contents, and I used the network analysis software Gephi to analyze the networks that result from thinking about the materials in this way. And it turns out that when you aggregate the information about which texts appear together with which other texts, starting with just 30 manuscripts, you end up with thousands of connections between texts, which is more than I can keep track of in my head. So visualizing it as a network is helpful in showing some patterns. This is a visualization of the texts appearing in these manuscripts, where we can see not only which texts are most common, those are the largest circles or nodes, but also, more importantly, how often each text appears in the company of each other text, which is what the lines or edges represent. And for me, what this shows is that there's an identifiable core of material that these school books share. A curriculum, in other words, but there's a lot of variation. Each person is putting together their own materials and supplementing that curriculum with whatever other things they wanted, or writing something new, whatever would be useful for their own situation. And this is important because the old stereotype of education in this period is that people are just kind of copying things at random and don't even really understand what they're doing. And we can also see which specific texts are found together more than with other texts. I used Gephi's modularity function to highlight groups of texts that gravitated toward each other and sort them into different colored groups. And this opens up various historical questions. Maybe texts that appear together came from the same region. Maybe a compiler thought that they were complementary. So the network visualization points me back toward thinking about various possible historical interpretations, but with a much better idea of which connections are important. I also turned this network inside out to look at a different set of issues. Instead of looking at the texts as nodes connected by the manuscripts that they're in, I looked at the manuscripts as nodes connected by the texts they mutually share. This looks a little like something manuscript scholars traditionally do, namely try to figure out which manuscripts were copied from which other ones. That method, stemmatology, has been an important textual tool for more than a century, and scholars have tried digital approaches like using phylogenetic software designed for evolutionary biology, and more recently customized for stemmatology to reconstruct relationships between manuscripts. But this is actually very different because I'm not trying to find any direct links between manuscripts. There's no evidence that connected manuscripts ever met each other. It's more that they have similar interests and might get along, and this approach is useful too. So the larger nodes here are manuscripts containing more texts, and they're related to other manuscripts based on the texts that they share. Again, the colors represent groups of manuscripts whose contents are more closely connected with each other. Like the other visualization, this is primarily useful in identifying interesting threads to pull in my research. So I can observe, for instance, that two manuscripts we think came from the same monastery are closely connected with each other, or that there are groups of manuscripts primarily concerned with a particular topic, like the letters of the alphabet. And both of these things are helpful in trying to figure out how these school books were used. All of this has been helpful to me in making sense of this set of sources, and I think for anyone working with a very interconnected set of material, whether it's books like Florilegia or miscellanies, collections of laws or recipes or literature, or other complex sets of material, these digital network approaches are potentially a very interesting addition to the toolkit.